this week, the Florida Governor Ron DeSantis published his memoir. And I hope that you will forgive me that I did not read it. DeSantis has spearheaded efforts to purge educational curricula of language that he and others find offensive. And this relates to discussions of race and the persistence of racism in the United States, famously banning an AP African American Studies course. It also relates to questions of sexuality. The now infamous Don't Say Gay bill prohibits mention of sexuality and sexual orientation from many classrooms. And this has caused teachers to remove books, hide pictures of their same-sex partners, and refuse to answer questions about why some children have parents of the same gender. Now, DeSantis views this not only as a political crusade. If he did, I don't think I'd get up here to preach about it today. He also views it as a religious crusade. His book is called The Courage to Be Free. And when I was looking at some of the reviews for the book, one of the things that interested me is that I don't think a lot of people picked up on the fact that his book title is actually taken from one of the most important theological works of the 20th century. That's Paul Tillich's The Courage to Be. And the interesting thing about Paul Tillich is that he was in exile from Germany during World War II. He fled. And The Courage to Be is a book that is vigorously anti-fascist. His theological point in that work is that we take our existential dread and anxiety and we displace it onto groups of other people, and then we try to purge them. He said that that's what causes fascism. And his theological response to that is that we have to find life-affirming alternatives that don't do that. I think that Ron DeSantis would have done well to read the book that he took the title of his own work from. But DeSantis's religious ideology is not just a subtle book reference. When speaking before a college, he said this: "I want you to put on the full armor of God. Stand firm against the left's schemes. You will face flaming arrows, but if you have the shield of faith, you will overcome them." It's not hard for me to imagine the kind of God that DeSantis holds as an image in his head. This is a God that upholds the status quo of power and privilege. It is a God that sanctions heterosexual marriage only, opposes gender-affirming care, does not believe in the existence of systemic racial inequality, that wants to strengthen borders and walls, that probably cares little for the environment. Now, one of the things that I love about Unitarian Universalism is that we embrace many different perspectives on God. And this includes people who are sitting here today who have a close personal relationship with God, and also people who do not use that language to communicate about truth and being. And what I would like to do today is just give people permission. Wherever you're at, there is nothing that I'm trying to convince you of about God. But I am today going to open a door. And this is a door to thinkers who write about God in some radical ways. And whether we use the language of God or not in our personal spirituality, I hope that we today can appreciate the radicalism and the courage that these theologians bring to their task of social critique. They shatter boundaries, they break open possibilities, they scale new horizons. They are known as queer theologians. Now, queer theology was pioneered by one of my favorite theologians, one that has been really personally transformative to me in terms of my own journey. Her name is Marcella Altus Reed. She is an Argentinian liberation theologian who became a professor in Scotland. And her books, Indecent Theology, Theological Perversions in Sex, Gender, and Sexuality, and The Queer God, have become pivotal in my appreciation of faith and also in the field known as queer theology. And I'm going to be offering a class on queer theology with Oslo Brewster. So, just a little bit of a headline here. If you're interested in learning more about Marcella Altus Reed and others, I encourage you to sign up. But today I'm going to give you just a little taste of what she's all about. Marcella Altus Reed uses a geographic understanding for how we think about God. And she says that we should think about God in the same way that people think about drawing maps. When you draw a map, you usually put yourself in the center. And this is true whether it is a map that is produced in the United States, or that is produced in China, or that is produced in Australia. It's a fairly natural thing for human beings to do. And as our knowledge of the world has grown, geographers and cartographers have become better at naming their location and why the map is drawn in the particular way that they've drawn it from their perspective. But Marcella Altus Reed makes the claim that this has not been true for theology. Theology instead has often made assumptions about all human beings in all times and places, and it has failed to see that the person writing that theology is often situating their interpretation at the center of human experience. And it has also failed to recognize the ways that situating itself in the center of experience can end up sanctifying power and privilege at the center of that map. And so we have official theologies that sanction heterosexuality and monogamous marriage and the dominance of men over women. We have a theology that's called the prosperity gospel, which sanctions wealth and equality by claiming that the people who have wealth are the ones who are favored most by God. And we have a theology that is a racialized theology. And this goes back to something that's called the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny, which asserts that God intended for white colonizers to take away the land of indigenous people. That is sanctified by God, according to these theologies. And it also goes back to interpretations of biblical texts that supported slavery and segregation. And we have a dominionist theology, which is a theology of nature that says that nature has been put here for humans to exploit and consume. These theologies cast long shadows, and they fail to recognize that they situate God at the center of power and privilege, claiming that that's where God lives and doesn't belong anywhere else. According to Marcella Altus Reed, these theologians who articulate God as being at the center of power and privilege, what they don't realize is that they are not simply describing God, which is what they claim to do. Instead, she says, they are imprisoning God. If God has anything to do with truth or with beauty or with life, then the privileged perspective has to be a hopelessly limited perspective. Truth and beauty and life don't just happen at the center of power and privilege. Truth and beauty and life don't just show up for people who drew the official map. Life also happens at the margins. Life flows through, bursts through, takes place in very different forms and possibilities. Life is wild and unbounded. In fact, life is probably more likely to show up on the margins than it is in the center, And this is because the center often offers a very sanctified version of human life, one that is unrealistic. Very few of us live lives that fit neatly and tidily within doctrines and ethical codes. And so Marcella challenges us to ask the question, God is a God of life and has sanctified all of life to flow forth in its wild diversity. What would it mean to think of God as not only existing at the center? What would it mean to think about God as a God of the margins? What would it mean to imagine God as showing up in the experiences and in the lives of the excluded? Well, I have a couple of ideas. And I'm going to frame them today as questions. What if God is the child who's been separated from their parents at the border? What if God is right now riding a bus full of migrants that have been forced to leave their native home and then forced to leave Florida and Texas for a northern city? What if God is on death row and has just been denied a final reprieve from the governor? What if God has a knee on his neck and can't breathe? What if the God is the teacher who has to hide the picture of their same-sex partner and know that every day they go into their classroom that that's something they have to turn over? What if God is the child who knows that they are born with a body that isn't right for them and is contemplating an ending to things? What if God is the queer kid who cannot find books in the library that offer affirmation about their experience? What if God is right now dressed in drag in Tennessee and has just been arrested? And let's make the lens even wider than this. What if God shows up in the damage that we've done to the natural world? What if God is the last tree before it's felled? What if God is the charred remains of a zone of sacrifice? What if God is the last of a member of a species that is about to go extinct? What if God is the final gasp of life in a river that has been hopelessly polluted? What if God is a whale or a dolphin, stomach bloated with plastic? What if God is a great horned owl that has just lost its habitat? What if God is the first blade of grass after a nuclear meltdown? What if God is the fragile, resilient sprout that swells after all of the old growth trees are gone? And it's not all heartbreak, you know. Because heartbreak isn't the only thing that happens at the margin of life and at the margins of society. There's also this wildness, there's this vitality, there is this joy that continues to break through. What if right now God's heart is beating faster because they just met their first crush? What if God is feeling a rush of pleasure right now because they just had their first sexual encounter? What if God is tasting the sweat on a lover's body, the gentle touch, and even the convulsion of orgasm? What if God is the sweet embrace of an older couple whose attraction has simply never worn thin? What if prayer and sex didn't live on distant corners of the universe, but were rather entwined in the same gesture? What if God loves pleasure in all of its forms? What if God sanctions those pleasures instead of the austerities of the prison that we have put God in? What if all of that is divine and holy? What if that is precisely where life and beauty and truth and goodness are showing up in our world today? And the reason that we struggle to believe that this is true is because we have such a limited and narrow perspective on who and where God can be. What if our imaginations are too limited, too confined, too hampered by the stories that we have been telling? You know, a funny thing is, it's not like this kind of thing hasn't been said before. It's not like God hasn't said that God shows up on the margins. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. I was exiled from my home country and you gave me shelter. I came out as queer and you accepted me. I told you I was trans and you simply believed me. The trees were disappearing and you protected me. The sprout was coming from the earth and you nurtured me. The animals were disappearing and you saved me. I was yearning and you touched me. I was lonely and you embraced me. I was aching and you tasted me. And the righteous will ask, when did we do that for you, my Lord?